Started. Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures' Daily Dose of Nature, Botswana's Okavango Delta at Desert Eden, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Russell Gerber. Thanks for being here today for us, Russell. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Colby, and thank you to everyone out there for joining us once again. It's a pleasure to be back with you all to talk today about one of my favorite places in the world, for sure. Easily one of my favorite safari destinations, but simply one of my favorite places on the planet to spend time. I haven't been out there for a while, but I'm looking forward to heading out there soon and enjoying one of the world's most incredible biodiversity hotspots. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. And let's get started. So first, as always, I need to just touch on who is talking to you. And if for those of you who don't know me, my name is Russell Gerber, coming to you live from Cape Town, cold and rainy Cape Town at the moment. That's why I'm dressed up in this big jacket. But yeah, I've been guiding with NatHab since 2018, but I've been in the business for many, many years as a safari and marine field guide since around 2004. I've been all over the world working in various locations, taking people to some amazing, amazing places. I actually studied marine biology, but a lot of focus was on the undergraduate part of zoology in African vertebrate biology. So quite a lot of time that I've spent out there in the last year or so. I've been working as a wildlife presenter at africam.com. So just staying at home and still getting to enjoy some of the wildlife. So that's also been a nice little change and a bit of fun for the year so far. So that's just a little bit about myself. And this photograph was actually taken in the Kwai concession. You can see the side of the vehicle there. And this was the Okavango Delta itself. Again, one of my favorite safari destinations. And this was last year, I believe, in February. So before all the madness started. So yeah, as I said, one of my favorite places on the planet. And as always, we're just going to go through a couple of the details and highlights of what we'll be chatting about today. First, we'll go through where it is, of course, for those of you who are not sure about that. We'll talk a little bit about what it is, how it was formed, and when it was formed, which is really interesting, and there's a lot of detail that comes with that. We'll also touch on the flora and fauna of the Okavango, which is, of course, why many of you are here this evening. And we'll also go into some conservation efforts for one of the world's most special wildlife areas. So that'll pretty much be the outline of what we'll be talking about today. And then, as always, we'll have some time for questions as we get towards the end. I also will, of course, touch on some travel tips. And again, if you have any questions about that, please send them through towards the end of the webinar. So that's pretty much the plan. So where are we? We are, of course, in Africa, and we're in the southern part of Africa. I'm coming to you right from the bottom in Cape Town. You can see it in the middle of your screen there. And we'll be talking today about South Africa's neighbor, one of our neighbors, Botswana. And that area, the little red circle that's just popped up on the screen, is roughly the area that we'll be talking about today, where the Okavango Delta is located. And zooming a little bit in so you get a better idea of that, here is a map of Botswana. So the southern border, of course, is South Africa. To its west, you'll see is Namibia. To the north, we have Angola and Zambia. And then to the east, Zimbabwe. So it is a landlocked country. And that's part of the reason why this is such an interesting location, the Okavango. Botswana is a country that is very much desert. A lot of it taken up by the Kalahari Basin. I did a chat about the Kalahari a few weeks ago for the Daily Dose of Nature, so you can go check that out as well, where we go into some of the detail about the Kalahari itself. But you see, it makes up a big part of the Botswana land area. And right up in the north western part of the country, you'll see is the Okavango Delta itself that we'll be focusing on today. So there you see that little red highlighted area is what we'll be chatting about. So zooming in just a little bit more, here we have the Okavango itself. So firstly, we got to chat about how it all started. And we're going to go through what really formed this whole area. It was formed by the movement of tectonic plates, really. So fault lines, various fault lines within the region that moved over the last few million years and actually shifted to create this entire environment. Big river systems that used to flow into the Indian Ocean were diverted essentially when the Zambezi River eventually cut through Africa and soaked up a lot of the rivers that were flowing down into this region. Initially, there were a number of rivers that flowed into Botswana through what is today the Okavango Delta and down to the southwestern part of this area that you're looking at now. You can see just a little bit of it, the Makgadikgadi pans in the bottom right of your screen, which used to all be part of a great super lake. We had a number of rivers flowing in here, and these fault systems or the fault lines that formed actually created a divergence where the water actually started to move away from this region, and the Makgadikgadi pans actually dried up, now one of the world's most famous salt pans. And today, what's really left is the main water body system is the Okavango Delta. And the main fault lines that created that is this first one that you can see, that red line right at the southern part of the delta itself. That is known as the Tamalakani fault line, and pretty much stops the rest of the water from flowing away. So it's slightly higher. Everything south of that line is a slightly raised up piece of land, and everything between that and the northern parts of the delta is actually a sunken area. Here you can see the second fault line, which is the Konyere fault. That fault line and the Tamalakani together help to keep the water from flowing further south. In a few years of high rainfall, where the water keeps flowing into the delta, you will occasionally get overflow where the water will actually flow past that and eventually into the Boteti River and into the Makgadikgadi itself. So from time to time, you can get that, but it will take a number of flood years to actually get over those two faults, the Konyere and Tamalakani fault. Next, we have the Chobe River and the Chobe Fault. So you'll see that line that's just come in there. That is the Chobe River line, and that is, one of the most productive areas in Botswana as well, and a very famous area for elephants in the region. That fault, along with the Linyanti Fault, those two areas, again, real diversity hotspots when it comes to your big herbivores in this region. And then the most important one when it comes to the Okavango, the Gomari Fault. So between the Gomari Fault, the Konyere, and the Tamalakani, that area, of course, is where the majority of the water of the Okavango Delta is maintained. And because of the two faults to the south, the water doesn't really have anywhere to go. And the majority of the water from the Okavango is actually lost to evaporation. It's actually evapotranspiration, but we'll get into that a little while later. But essentially, the water disappears and is unable to flow out from anywhere. So this Gomari Fault and those two faults to the south pretty much form the basin and this depression, which allows the water to flow into the region. And then just to the sides of the Okavango River, so that main water system that you can see flowing in there is actually called the Okavango River. You've got two faults that actually create this little panhandle system, and those are called the Panhandle Faults. Between all those faults together, they create this system that we're going to be talking about today. And it's not just the formation of these faults that make it such a unique area. What's so special about it is also the type of soil that we have here, and then also the timing of the floods that arrive here. Now, we're going to go into that in just a moment, but one of the most important things to remember about the Okavango is that it is dependent on water that's coming from a long way away. And that water mainly falls in the Angolan highlands. So where is it? It's situated in the northwestern part of the country, as we spoke about in Botswana. It is actually a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it has an area of about 22,000 kilometers. Only around 15,000 of that, depending on your water flow in a certain year will actually be water systems. As I mentioned, it's also made of different things consisting of floodplains, grasslands, sand masses, islands, etc. And we'll get back to that in a few moments as well. But it is a really massive region. It's an average rainfall of about 500 millimeters, which pretty much falls between October to April, the summer months down here in the south. So a relatively low rainfall area when compared to other wildlife hotspots in Africa. The delta itself falls within the greater Kalahari Basin, so it's actually technically part of the Kalahari Desert. So even though it does receive more rainfall than an average desert, it's still technically a very dry area and has very sandy soils. But what is important to remember is that the annual evaporation rate is 5 times that of the rainfall. So again, you have to bear in mind that technically would make it a very, very dry region, and you would consider that would be a difficult place for animals to live. And yet it supports a huge number of some of Africa's biggest herbivores, and which of course require huge amounts of vegetation to feed on. So the main catchment, as I mentioned, is in the central highlands of Angola, but it's about 900 kilometers away. So that water takes time to get down to the delta. The rains up there are generally falling, around about the middle of the year, towards the end of the year, around October, November, December, which is typically the rainy season for the Okavango Delta. And that receives a lot more rainfall, so between 1,200 or 1,800 millimeters of rainfall. And it's actually the origin of the Zambezi River as well, the same highland area. So an area that produces a huge amount of water. And some of that water, of course, flows into different rivers. The 3 main ones that we'll be considering today is the Okavango, Quetta, Kwando rivers that all actually flow into Botswana to form the Okavango River, which we've touched on a little earlier. As I mentioned, the majority of the sand in the region is Kalahari derived and deposited by these rivers over millions of years. We chatted briefly about the super lake, the Mekharihari super lake, and because of the slow movement of the rivers that were cutting back across the continent from east to west, particularly the Zambezi River, slowly capturing all those rivers, the flow of water down into the delta really got more and more limited, to the point now where we only have these 3 rivers running into the Okavango, providing all of the water flowing into the system. So the waters begin to spread through the main alluvial fan of the delta around May, June, and July. So that's the wettest time of the year when you visit the delta. What's important to remember is that's also relatively dry. It's normally at its highest in around August, the water levels in the delta, but your dry season is very much that time of year. Your rains would have stopped at around February, April. So from May, June, and July, you would have had no real rainfall around. Water then starts to flow in from the highlands of Angola, and around about September, you start to see the waters receding in parts of the delta. Around about November, you start getting some late afternoon thunder showers, particularly in the northeastern parts of it. You'll start seeing these big storms, normally at around 4 or 5 o'clock, clouds build up and you get a short, powerful storm, which reinvigorates the whole area after the water has started to move back, and actually gives you almost a second flow or flood towards the end of the year. Of course, depending on how much rainfall arrives. What's interesting though, and what's great about this photograph, is that the channels of the delta are really important and are actually changed and maintained by large herbivores. We're going to go into that a little bit later, but you can see in this picture the beautiful movement of water all the way through the delta. And one thing you need to remember is that the gradient across the entire Okavango Delta is very, very low. So the water flows really slowly. There's no fast flowing rivers. So the movement of water is important in the formation of these little islands, oxbow lakes, and actually the terrain itself across the entire delta. One of the most important things, though, that people often actually can't believe and that are so important in the formation of the islands within the delta is actually termites and their mounds. When you look at a lot of parts of the Okavango, and you'll see in this photograph just to the right of these lions is a pretty old termite mound. They can get quite a lot bigger than this. But what's interesting is, of course, is that those animals are resting on this slightly raised area, and that sort of brings to mind how this all works. Very often, the termites form a tree deposited there from a seed that was deposited by a bird that may have been carrying it in its feces, will actually then grow out of the side of that termite mound. So more often than not, the termite mound is there first before the the rest of the island itself, and often forms the start of these small circular islands that you see across the delta. So they play an amazingly important role in actually creating the terrain in the delta itself. All of these different cycles of flood, of the dry season, of things drying up and the evaporation of water create this cycle that's really, really important for the survival of these animals. Excuse me. And the reason for that is if the water kept flowing in the same channels and to the same places, you would get, of course, this deposit of salt. As the water evaporates, the saline solids would be left behind, and that is very much the case in the Okavango. You'll get slowly more and more saline islands, normally starting from the center of the island, and as it gets older, more and more salt will be deposited in the center, and it becomes absolutely toxic, where plants actually can't grow in the center. But because the animals are constantly moving around and the bigger animals are creating these new channels, you get different amounts of flood. The water actually changes course, and the different channels help to alleviate the pressure of the salination of these islands. And also the islands themselves almost work as a salination filter, where they stop the salt from actually moving into the rest of the delta, and that island will slowly die on its own. So you have a number of islands across the delta that are pretty much bereft of any vegetation, except for those plant species that are adapted to the more saline environment around the edges of those islands. So a unique area to look at as well, which we'll come back to in a few moments. The delta itself is made up of three main components: the panhandle, the permanent swamp, and the seasonal swamp. And we're going to go into that now so that you can see what I'm talking about. Sorry, I've had a little bit of a cold recently. So now you can have a look here what I'm talking about. You'll see this is the panhandle in the little red arrow that you can see there. Panhandle named basically as looking like a pan below it. Here you'll see the permanent swamp where the green arrows are, and most of that permanent water that you can see around there. And on the outskirts, you get the seasonal swamp or floodplains that you get throughout the Okavango Delta, which are hugely productive for the big herbivores. As the water comes and goes, the saline levels change, you get a movement of water, a movement of nutrients, and therefore a lot of vegetation that can grow and thrive in certain regions, which is hugely nutritious to the big herbivores that come through there. And which animals are these? Which are the ones that are having the big impact on the formation of the delta itself? When you look at all those pathways we spoke about, of course, the most obvious would be your big animals like elephant. And elephant moving through the delta, moving through the water, help to create these channels and move the water into different regions in the Okavango itself. And they play a big role, not only in creating those channels, but even on land, breaking down trees, creating new environments for animals to survive. Often in times of dry weather, they will be breaking down branches where the rest of the small animals and mammals wouldn't have access to that food, and now they're able to actually utilize the food as the elephant moves on. So they play a big role in creating small niches for other animals, but in the formation of the delta itself and the various channels, just by walking through the water during the flood season, they create new channels, which of course allows the water to flow into different directions every year. Here's another clip of, or picture of just of a beautiful young elephant, also taken in the Okavango Delta. And again, just a reminder of the number of elephants out there. You know, in certain regions, you can have upwards of 50,000 elephants in certain parts of the Okavango. And of course, that number of animals, you know, big male elephant weighing in at a roughly 6 tons, is going to have a huge role to play in the formation of this environment, as I mentioned. Another one, which is really important in the formation of these channels, is of course hippo. This was taken in the Okavango, and as things were drying up, actually, and you can see they're resting on each other, and the water was starting to get shallow in certain regions. When that happens, the hippos will often move into the more permanent channels, and things can get a little crowded. Often there's a little bit of territorial infighting, but that's how they'll do things. And by moving in and around the outskirts of the seasonal plains, they will create more and more channels as well. But for the most part, the hippos tend to stay in the permanent channels and will move out from there, particularly your young males who are displaced by the bigger males. So they'll spend time out on the outskirts looking for their own territories until they're big and strong enough to challenge for their own. But as they make all those movements for gaining territory, but also just for grazing, they will create these little channels that help to move the water around the delta, as we spoke about. Another one that you have to consider, of course, is the birds. And as I mentioned already, these small termite mounds that create the start of these little islands can grow from birds landing on them, having a small dropping, land on there with seeds in it, and from there actually creating an island that can become sometimes a few 100 kilometers in size. So over time, these islands can get really, really large as more and more vegetation grows on the island. But what's amazing about the Okavango is the number of bird species. Around 440 bird species across the Okavango, all of them spending time flying from region to region and helping to grow the Okavango each year. With every formation of a new termite mound, a bird dropping some fecal matter on those mounds themselves, you will then get the slow growth of new islands across the delta almost constantly. So it's a constantly changing environment, and is another reason why it's so important for these animals to keep coming. Another one that is, of course, responsible for the seed dispersal as well and growing these islands is primates. This is a little bush baby. You also, of course, we get monkeys, we get the chacma baboons, all help to spread the various seeds across the islands and between the islands to help grow them as more and more vegetation grows. So those are your most important when it comes to the actual formation of the delta. And so I wanted to bring up this picture again so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. And you can see all the little channels in between the bigger channels are actually created by the big mammals that we just spoke about. So those big herbivores, elephants and hippo, create those smaller channels. Create those smaller channels to then actually have what you see here, this almost mosaic of pathways and animal pathways across the Okavango. This is just a small region in one of the seasonal floodplain areas. And this, of course, will slowly dry up as you get into the drier parts of the year. So as you get into around about November, December, even though the rains are starting to come, very often these areas will start to lose many of the channels, and you'll only get the big, thick, permanent channels left around that time of year. As that happens, of course, things get a little bit more difficult in terms of the fresh and new vegetation, and it becomes a little bit more of a time of plenty for your predators. So the dry season around about, as I mentioned, the October, November time, just before the rain, September, October, November, tends to be the best time for the predators. They get much more opportunity to take on animals that are now slightly losing condition as you know that the vegetation is no longer available. And just before the rains arrive in December is really the best time for them. So if you're ever thinking of heading out there in terms of your predator-prey interaction, certainly October, November as hot and as dry as it may be, is an amazing time to witness those sorts of interactions. What we have to say before we carry on, though, is that the Okavango is actually not a true delta. We often laugh about it that it's a little bit of good marketing. It's not really a delta, but it is in fact an alluvial fan. But I think the Okavango alluvial fan doesn't sound quite as good as the Okavango Delta, but that is in fact what it truly is in terms of a geological or geographical location. So it's made up of various channels, oxbow lakes, meandering islands, different sandbanks, and of course the floodplains that we mentioned. And all of that together form so many different environments and habitats that make for, one of the most diverse and certainly big animal wildlife hotspots in Africa, if not the world. Different habitats, like I mentioned, that include things like savanna. This is actually a floodplain that we're looking at here with this lioness, and a lot of this grass below her will be inundated with water around about June, July, August. But between that, she can walk through quite easily without having to worry too much about actually having to swim. But many of the drier, bigger islands actually have savanna areas, which of course are hugely productive when it comes to grazing. Other habitats include woodlands. You can see in the background, it's very thick woodlands. Mopani woodland is very common across the northern parts of the Okavango. It's a hugely productive area for elephants. They love Mopani leaves. And so that is an area that really gets high numbers of elephant. As you go into certain parts, you also get these teak woodlands right up in the north, actually more towards the Chobe area. The elephants actually don't really like that, so you often get huge stands of the Zimbabwe teak that carries on, or Zambezi teak, depending on who you ask, that carries on for miles up towards the Chobe region, almost untouched and really green most of the year round. We get riverine forests along the permanent river systems, mainly along the Okavango River in the north. The islands that I mentioned, formed by termites and the vegetation growing therefrom. After years and years and years forming these small islands, and on the outskirts of that, you often get what we call wild date palm, which are really able to deal with the saline soils often associated with these small islands. And often on the edge of those islands, we also get these big real fan palms, which are pretty famous in the Okavango. We've got some pictures coming up a little later where you'll see some of those. Of course, open water and the big main channels, and then the permanent swamp that we spoke about, where you get your main channels pretty much throughout the year. And then the seasonal floodplains where this lioness is standing that you can see right now. So here you see a very damp kitty cat. This is, of course, another lioness, also taken in the Okavango Delta. And we got to talk a little bit about the animals themselves. So as I mentioned, those big animals we spoke about have a huge role in actually forming the delta and what we see existing in that area today. But the place itself is hugely diverse because of all those various aspects, from the geological to the animals to the simple timing of the arrival of water and the dry season throughout the year. So let's just come back to that quickly. We've got January, February, March, generally pretty dry, but you've got your rainy season. And because it's not a huge high rainfall season, it tends to be a difficult time for many of the animals in terms of your herbivores. As you get into May, June, and July, we start getting the flood arriving up from the Angolan highlands. Very, very wet. This picture was taken roughly in June, and you can see loads of water around, and the predators are forced to go through these various channels to take on their prey. They have no choice. There's just not enough dry area, and many of the herbivores have moved into different parts of the delta because there's now more water available. As things start to dry out around October, September, October, November, the channels, those seasonal floodplains and seasonal channels all dry up, and the herbivores are forced back towards these permanent channels, which again plays into the hands of the predators. So that's pretty much the cycle we look at every year. Roughly 120 species of mammal in the delta itself, and of course some of the most famous are of course the big five, all of which are highly adapted in this region to living in this changing environment, whether it be wet, where they have to walk through these channels and swim in some cases, or of course when it's dry and there's very dusty regions, sometimes prone to fires in certain years. All of that they have to adapt and live with in what can be a challenging but also hugely productive environment. And who are the big five? Well, many of you will know. The first and foremost, of course, is the big old lion. And this is the African lion, of course. Again, another shot taken from the Okavango. So many of the lions here are really not afraid of water. You often get asked about that. Do the lions actually like swimming? For the most part, they don't look like they do. Certainly when they come out the other side, they look pretty unhappy and pretty soaked through. But they're forced to do that at certain times of the year. And in the Okavango, these lions have got no problem doing that. So very much adapted to life in the Delta. They'll give birth to their cubs pretty much any time of year, but often with a peak at around October, November, when hunting is best and it's easiest for the moms to actually take down prey and bring those cubs through to adulthood. The next one of our major big five is, of course, the leopard, easily one of the most sought after animals when we're out here on safari. The leopard is very secretive, but does exceptionally well across the Okavango. A huge number of environments that really play into their lifestyle. Of course, for the most part, they are solitary, besides the time that they spend either mating or with their cubs. For the rest of that time, they're quite secretive. They enjoy the more riverine, forested areas where they can use cover to ambush their prey. And that's often where you'll find them, around the thicker woodland areas on the edge of permanent water sources, depending on what's available. But the leopard viewing in the Okavango can be exceptional. But I can tell you that a leopard that doesn't want to be seen will not be seen. So this shot was also taken in the Okavango in February last year. This one as well, actually a few more years back. This one was about 5 years ago. A young cub. This was in I think it was a jackalberry tree, and spent its time waiting for its mom. It was actually left alone in the tree while mom was off hunting. And we were fortunate enough to spot it. There was no one else around. And it's one of the unique and magical things of the Okavango that we got to sit in for a few hours, just our vehicle. And eventually mom came back and she had killed something. She came back to fetch her cub, and then they actually went back to the kill, which was a small impala that she had dragged up a tree not too far away. So leopard, of course, hugely sought after and one of the big five. Elephant, which we've already mentioned, of course, one of the most popular animals to see on safari. And there are huge numbers of elephants in the Delta. They move up and down into different parts according to the season and according to the flood. When there's more water available, they'll move into the outskirts of the Delta. But as things dry up, they'll move back down towards the channels. So at certain times of the year, if there are heavy rains around January or December and January, often the elephants are quite hard to see around that time. When you come back in around October, where things are very dry, many of the elephants will be concentrated around those permanent water sources, and again, a little bit easier to find. But with numbers in the regions of 20 to 100,000 elephants in certain parts of the Okavango, it really is one of the best places in the world to see the African elephant. The next one, of course, is rhino. And rhino, of course, under so much pressure from poaching over the last 30 or 40 years now. And in certain parts of the Okavango, the rhino has actually been reintroduced. Sadly, it was actually exterminated in the region. And these rhinos that are here now were actually brought in through various conservation programs, the most famous of which was the Rhinos Without Borders program, where rhinos were relocated from South Africa, actually flown in some cases in helicopter and dropped into certain regions, not dropped heavily, gently into what we call a boma, and then slowly acclimatized to the region before they were released, often with a radio tag and with notching on the ears. If you look at this rhino, you'll see a few little notches in the ears. notches are put there so that we can identify the rhino itself. And in this particular case, you'll see the top of the horn was actually cut off slightly. That is to get a genetic trace of what the actual rhino is. And if that horn turns up anywhere in the world, we'll be able to know exactly where it comes from. So rhinos have been reintroduced. This is a white rhino. They've also reintroduced black rhino into the region, and they're actually doing really, really well. That was to alleviate some of the pressure on rhinos in South Africa, and movement into the Delta helped with that, and they've been doing really, really well in the last 20 years or so since the program started. The last of the big five is, of course, the African buffalo or Cape buffalo. This is a herd also in the Delta, and what you'll see here, and why I wanted to put this picture in, is how dusty it is. This was around about November, and you can see a little bit of grass coming through. There'd been a little bit of rain for about 3 or 4 weeks before, so you started to see some new fresh grass growth coming through, but a big fire had come through about a month before, and because of that, you get a lot of dust around when the buffaloes walk through, and that's what really I wanted to show you here. So when it's very dry, the Okavango can be prone to fires, but again, as in so many cases, those fires can be play a huge role in reinvigorating the whole environment, the vegetation itself, to bring through fresh new growth, and of course bring those herbivores back again. And that's what these buffaloes were here for. So the big five, of course, is the big draw card to the Okavango. But there are, of course, some of the other specials that are always amazing to see. And one of the best places to see this animal, the African wild dog, is, of course, also the Okavango Delta. And one of my favorite animals, I did a chat about these amazing animals not too long ago, so you can check it out on the website from the Golden Pack. It was all about this group of wild dogs around Vumbra Plains, which is the northeastern part of the Okavango, and just an amazing group of animals. And of course, Africa's most endangered large predator. So a really, really special animal, and an excellent place to see one of these special predators in the wild. Another one that you do see in the Delta in certain regions, not quite as common these days. Unfortunately, the cheetah is under pressure. I also did a chat about these on our daily dose of nature, which you can check out. They are very much under pressure in terms of the other predators. They often get forced into the outskirts of the region by bigger predators like lions, leopard, and hyena. In certain places, they're quite difficult to find, but always a possibility when on safari in the Okavango. And I've had some of my best cheetah viewing in my life, actually, in the Delta itself. So also something to keep an eye out for if you ever manage to come and visit. One of the infamous species that we do get around in good numbers across the Delta is, of course, the spotted hyena. In certain regions, they are actually the dominant predator, simply because of their numbers and their power, but a really special animal, and often given a pretty bad reputation in terms of what they actually can do in the environment and how caring they are for the rest of their clan. Hyenas are actually really one of my quiet and secret favorites as well, but a great place to see them, often, of course, in large numbers, particularly around kills, and often not too far away from the wild dogs that we just spoke about. They know how good a hunter the wild dog is, and often you'll see them following closely behind the pack of wild dogs. Other species you can expect to find out here, of course, the big mammal species, of course, zebra, Burchell's zebra across almost all of the Okavango. Of course, the giraffe as well. We get the southern giraffe in the region. And something quite special that you often find in the Delta itself is red lechui. These were running away from some wild dogs while we were out on safari. And another, which I don't have a photograph of because I've never actually managed to snap one before, I've only seen one from helicopter over the Okavango, is the sitatunga, another antelope that is highly adapted for life in the water. They've got significantly split hooves, which allows them greater surface area to run through the water, which they often utilize as an escape route to get away from your predators. So amazing animals to see, and in only a small part of Africa where you can see these two species. So certainly something to keep an eye out for if you get down to the Okavango. And not my best shot, I have to admit, but I did want to put it in there because it was, again, the best shot that I got. Something you can also find in the Delta in certain dry regions. This was just on the outskirts of a Mapani woodland. That is a pangolin running off into the long grass there. And we got just this little view as we were driving back to our sundowner spot for a gin and tonic in the bush. This little chap ran off into the bush away from us, which was a massive, massive bonus, something you really don't see every day, but again, very high on many people's lists in terms of species to spot in the Okavango or on safari. Then, of course, we got these creepy crawlies, the crocodiles. Reptiles themselves make up quite a lot of the species in the Delta. 64 different reptile species have been recorded there. This one, of course, is the most famous. A number of different snake species as well. Your most notable will be the venomous species like the Mozambican spitting cobra. You'll also get things like puff adder, and in certain parts the black mamba as well. But certainly the most famous is the Nile crocodile, the only species of crocodile that we get in the Okavango, and you'll find them in mostly the permanent water systems, and every now and again in the seasonal water flows. So just depends on where you go, but every now and again you can spot them quite far away from water as well. So always worth keeping a lookout for the crocodile when you're out here. And this one was also taken, this photo taken in the Delta as well. Then something we certainly do need to touch on, what are the threats to the Okavango and various conservation programs in place? Well, as I mentioned, the Okavango is a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which of course allows it a lot of protections. What's interesting to me though is that it is completely reliant on water sources outside of Botswana, and that is certainly the biggest threat to the Okavango. Their relationship with Angola is always going to be pivotal in the survival of this incredible and very fragile ecosystem. And of course, what is that major threat? Well, if Angola decides to dam any of the major rivers that flow into the Okavango, that could have significant impact on the system itself, and it could make it disappear in a few short years if it did go that way. Of course, relations are fairly good between the countries, and that would be by far the biggest threat posed to the Delta itself. There are certain areas as well where there has been some search for various oil fields. Again, so far we haven't had any real follow-up on that, but again, the umbrella of the World Heritage Site status does give it some protection from the potential utilization of various interested parties. So those are the major threats, I would say, to the Okavango itself. In terms of the conservation of the area, the biggest role player in the conservation of the Okavango is, of course, the Botswanan government. And for many years, they've been running very close relationships and very good systems when it comes to their tourism and conservation programs within the Delta area. So all of your operators, various tour operators, have very short leases with the government. They are forced to have very strict rules in place in terms of what they can build and how they build things. So the impact on the Delta itself from the lodges has been really, really small. And with that, you get these incredible, incredible wild areas for miles and miles. Not a huge number of lodges either. They've been quite good in restricting the number of lodges that there are across the Delta, and even just the numbers of people at each lodge are generally lower than some of the other safari regions. Those factors altogether make it easily one of the best safari areas to visit just because of that exclusivity. But in many cases, it can be hard to get to. We touched on some of the other conservation programs, one of which, of course, was that wonderful program of Rhinos Without Borders, and of course, a number of other projects when it comes to wild dogs, which you can check out in that chat about the golden pack that I told you about. And if you're ever interested in traveling to the Okavango, well, when should you go? How should you go? Well, the best time to go is really up to you. It depends on what you want to see. The wet season, as I mentioned, when there's a lot of water in the delta, tends to be when there's less rain, which is around June and July. So if you're really interested in seeing the delta flooded, that is a great time to go for that. But you will sometimes struggle then to see a number of the predators, but it just depends on your luck. Yeah, I've seen some great stuff in the wet season as well. So it really just depends on what you want to see in terms of the landscape. If you go in the drier season, you're likely to see more predator-prey interaction, but again, you won't see the delta inundated with water, which is often so much what it's famous for. How do you get there? Well, most of the trips go through South Africa, where you'll fly into Johannesburg and then a short flight up to the Okavango, pretty much through the gateway town, which is Mounds, and from there a small plane into all the camps. For the most part, the camps are not accessible by road, so you'll have to take a short plane flight and land on the small little gravel airstrips, and then you'll be taken across to the lodge. But all of that helps to create this incredible exclusive environment to actually visit the region, and is one of the reasons why it's such a great place to go on safari. This was taken from a safari there a few years ago. This is from Vumbra Plains, an amazing lodge, and this is the view out from your room. One of the trips that we have going out there from NatHab point of view is the secluded Botswana trip, visiting various parts of the Okavango. It also goes up to the Linyanti, a really, really special trip, including some of the most incredible concessions across the Okavango. Others that are really famous, the Maremi Game Reserve, including Chief's Island, is often considered one of the best places to go on safari in the Okavango. Vumbra, as I mentioned, and the Kwedi concession. Jau concession is another often considered one of the best places to visit, but there are many, many more that you can check out. And if you ever have any questions, you can always drop us an email and we can do our best to answer for you. But really loads of great spots to go, but at the same time, they're generally small camps, so you get this real feeling of being out in the wild and enjoying, one of the most incredible wildlife areas on the planet, with some luxury, mind you, as you can see in this picture from Vumbra Plains. And that's about it from my side, folks. Just a brief outline. There's obviously so much to say about the Okavango. There's so much information that we could go into. We could do an entire week just talking about the geomorphology of the whole area, but really that's just a brief outline of one of my favorite places to go and visit. So thank you so much for listening, and over to you, Colby, if there's any questions.
Thanks, Russell. I really appreciate it. That was really fascinating. Before we start the Q&A, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit your own questions via the questions field that's in the GoToWebinar control panel. So with that, let's start with some of the questions that folks have asked during your presentation, Russell. We did have a fair amount of questions about the geomorphology. Maybe we can start there. I'll throw out a couple of different things that people are asking about. Maybe you can just discuss it a little bit if you don't mind.
No problem.
So, yeah. So some folks are wondering about the faults. Are they still active? Why is it called a delta rather than a lake? And is this watery region difficult to access?
Okay, it's a good question. Let's go back to the fault line. So I'll just rush back there quickly. The faults are not active anymore. So, I mean, to the degree that there's any real tectonic action there now, that's not really the case. I think we've gone all the way back now. But to be honest, the interesting thing about it is that it's just created the environment for the delta itself. So in reality, you're just not really seeing any movement of those faults today. It's just the creation of it. So they're quite ancient in terms of their formation, and because of that, at this stage, very stable. I think the last real tectonic movement there that was around 60 years ago now, that people actually noticed. So for the most part, it is really stable. So here we are with those fault lines. So as I mentioned, the important thing to remember about them is actually not so much, if they're still active in any way. It's more so that they were the reason for the formation of it itself. And the reason that it's not called a lake is that it dries up every year, you know, so it's got a number of small channels created by the various animals, as we spoke about, and as things dry up, the shape of it as it spreads out, the low gradient of the whole area, it forms what is technically an alluvial fan, as I mentioned. So technically it should be called the Okavango alluvial fan, but it's still dubbed the delta. Some people actually called it the Okavango swamps. When I grew up, it was often referred to as the swamps, which is potentially a more accurate name for it, certainly in the wet season. And then what was the last part of the question, Colby?
Yeah, just about general accessibility. Is this a difficult region to access and to move around in?
Yeah, again, very good point. You know, at certain times of the year when you're out there on safari, June and July, August, certain channels you just can't get through. You know, most of the vehicles are equipped with incredible off-roading capability when it comes to actually driving through the water. We often have an exhaust system snorkel that goes above the water that allows us to drive through these deep channels, but some of them are too deep to even do that. So again, there is some restriction in terms of your movement at certain times of year. It's also a big reason why majority of the camps across the Okavango are only accessible by small plane. Certain times of year in the dry season you can drive in, but pretty much always you have to fly in to enjoy the far reaches of the delta, certainly. So those are some of the challenges you would deal with. But again, you know, in terms of your experience on the ground, there's really it has no real impact except for where you can and can't drive. Just on that line, you know, one of the reasons why the Chief's Island, which I touched on earlier, is so popular is that it is a permanent the biggest dry island in the Okavango. And because of that, you get pretty much access and you can go on game drive in a large area for a lot more of the year. So your chances of seeing things in that region are often increased because of that. But again, across the delta, you know, the animals can move anywhere they want, so you never know what you might see. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, very good, thanks. You know, sticking with this theme of questions, we have a number of people that are curious, how come parts of the delta are salty if it's not the ocean?
Yeah, good point. So as the rivers flow into pretty much all water sources or water systems, they will pick up saline aspects along the way from the minerals that they simply flow through in the soil. And what happens is that as the water flows into this region, for the most part, it's actually fairly low in saline content. But because you're getting 5 times the evaporation rate as the rainfall rate, you're losing a lot of water every year. Now, I mentioned the transpo evaporation, so it's not simply the sun drying, it's actually the plants are also drawing the water through their own systems, transpiring it through their leaves, and then actually leaving this salt behind. So the very small traces of salt in just about any river system gets left behind when it evaporates. And that salt slowly builds up over time. Now, in certain locations on the small islands, that salt gets stronger and stronger each year as it floods and then dries out. The middle of those islands is the highest concentration of salt, and you'll get less and less as you go out. Eventually, as I mentioned, the center of those islands become too toxic for anything to grow. And when you fly over the delta, you'll see these little toxic spots. On the outskirts of that, almost in a perfect circle in some cases, you have these saline adapted plants that can actually grow around the edges of it, and that will then form almost its own filter for the salt as well. So all of that helps to clear the water out, and when the channels change, it doesn't flow through there again, so the salt is actually left on the island and it sits there sometimes for years, and it helps to keep the water not saline as it flows through the delta itself. So even though it's not the sea, all river systems, as they flow through the water, will pick up small traces of salt, and the evaporation will then leave that salt behind, which can build up over years.
Okay, very good. Another very popular question today, Russell, is could you clarify again when the wet and dry months are, and then maybe just touch a little bit on what the differences in the wildlife viewing experience might be like between those?
Yeah, so it's a good question because it's actually, it sounds almost backwards. So when it comes to the rainfall or rainy season, so the rainy season is around, as I mentioned, December, January, and February. So very much our summer months. But the rainy season is not necessarily the wet season. Because of the flow of water into the delta, that water all the way up from Angola tends to arrive around about June and July, which would suggest it should be the driest time of the year when it comes to rainfall. As we get out of those summer months, the rainfall drops and we get almost no rain between often April all the way through to November. So that should be our dry season. But actually the water flowing in from those Angolan highlands starts to come in around June, sometimes even a little earlier. So when it comes to the rainy season is in the summer, our summer. So as I mentioned, you've got December, January, and February pretty much. And then your dry season is from April all the way through to October, November again. But it all gets confused by that flood coming in the middle of the year. So that's really why it is such a productive system. It has a flow of water and a changing environment that still allows for vegetation growth almost throughout the year. So that's why it can be confusing. In terms of what you might see, remember I said as things dry up towards October and November, you'll see more and more animals concentrating towards the permanent water sources, the permanent channels, and with that you get better predator-prey interactions, often around October, November. As you head into the rainier season, the animals and the environment gets reinvigorated, and often you'll see elephants and various herbivores moving off into different regions to enjoy that new growth that you'll get with the rainy season. And then as the things start to dry out again around April and May, just about that time you get the water starting to arrive from the flood. So it gives another reinvigoration to the region, and any time of year really is a good time to go. But I would certainly say if you're keen on the predators, October, November is your best time to go. It's really hot though, I have to remind you.
Great. When is the best time to see predators was one of the next questions. We also have a viewer wondering when is the best time to see hippos then in that whole scheme.
Again, depending on where you go, pretty much any time of year. You know, the permanent channels almost always have hippos in them, and you can see them in large numbers even when you're flying over the delta. So any time of year really for the hippos. Again, even in the dry season, the hippos will concentrate into certain parts of the delta. So you may even have better chance of seeing them then, again, in that sort of October, November timeframe. One of the reasons why, though, that time is not so popular to go is because of the heat. You know, the parts of the delta can get easily 100 degrees in the middle of the day, Fahrenheit, of course, and that can be, you know, off-putting. The June and July, August months are much more reasonable. Most temperatures maxing out at around the mid 80s, and getting pretty chilly at night sometimes. But for the most part, it's a much more reasonable weather time to go, June, July, and August. But again, you know, often your best game viewing is around the October, November, December time frame, just depending on what you're looking for.
Great, thanks. One more wildlife question. We have a few apparent birders with us today that are wondering when the best time to see some of the 400 odd species of birds you mentioned is.
Yeah, so for sure, you know, the best time for that is going to be the summer season. You know, we have quite a few migrant birds. So easily your summer season as you go into December, January, I would say, if you've had decent rains, is a really good time for birding. Even at the end of the dry season, you can get some good birding when the summer migrants arrive. But I would say certainly that green season, January, February, March, also really good times. So if you want to catch a little bit of the flood and get some good birding, I would say maybe on that shoulder season around March and April is a really wonderful time to see the Delta in its full flowery beauty, and to have those summer migrant birds around.
Okay, well, fantastic. Thank you, Russell. We really appreciate it. That's the last question we have today. How about I hand it back over to you for a few closing comments?
Yeah, thank you so much, Colby, and thank you everyone for joining me. It's been my pleasure chatting about the Okavango. As I said, really one of my favorites, and we've only just touched the surface today. So honestly, if you're interested in coming out, do get in touch. It's a place that I encourage anyone who's thinking of going on safari to visit, for all of the reasons we've spoken about today, but mainly just because it feels like a place lost in time. It's been wild and wonderful like that for thousands of years, and it really feels like it's untouched in many ways. So do get out there if you get the chance, and hopefully we'll get to host you all again soon in some of these amazing places. I know we've got 1 or 2 NatHab trips out there at the moment, but it really is a special safari location, and I can't recommend it more highly. So get down here when you can, but as always, thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to present with us today, Russell. We appreciate it. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow, of course, for our next daily dose of nature. You can check this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody.